Hi, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And usually, what I like to do is prepare a story about a new discovery or new paper that recently came out, like in the past week or so. And there is a study that I talked about a couple days ago, but because of a project on which I'm working for my new job, that's sort of consumed pretty much all time I have when my eyes are open. I wasn't able to prepare it fully for today, but I will just touch on some of the things that this group did. So this is a group out of Cambridge University who were interested in addressing one of the main causes for people to require liver transplants. And so basically what this group did, in summary, was they grew some organoids. They grew some organoids to potentially treat dysfunctional bile ducts. And so here you can see these organoids growing. Just pretty wild to watch. So organoids, if in case you're unfamiliar, you don't remember, these are basically mini versions of organs. So you can grow an organoid for pretty much any organ system: the brain, skin, and liver cells or bile ducts. And so it turns out that about a third of the causes for the need for a liver transplant in adults, about a third of them are due to dysfunctional bile ducts. And about 70% of the need for liver transplants in children is attributable to dysfunctional bile ducts. So this is a very, very significant source of suffering. And getting a liver transplant isn't exactly the most pleasant experience, and it can be very difficult to make happen, to pull off. And so what this group did was basically they created organoids, right, as you can see here, and they basically showed that what they could do was infuse them into the biliary tree. Or here, maybe I'll show you this. Nope. This. So bile ducts is essentially it's what it sounds like. They're ducts for bile. And there's a bunch of different areas where you can find them. And in green here, in this, like, the sort of area that looks sort of like a steak, the sort of darker red area, you can see that green biliary tree where they all sort of perfuse or sort of they invade the liver. And so basically what this group showed was that if they infused, and here's the team, and so that they could infuse these cells into the biliary tree and basically repair otherwise dysfunctional bile ducts. And so what they were doing, they were working with livers that were derived from donors, but the livers were deemed to be unsuitable for transplant, right? They weren't healthy enough due to dysfunctional bile ducts. And so what you can see here is their machine. You can sort of see it right there, which is holding what are called packed red blood cells, basically like the type of blood that can be used for transfusions and stuff like that. And in the sort of Tupperware in the middle here is probably a human liver. And so basically what they could show, and I'm sort of summarizing, like they have a bunch of different figures. This paper was published in Science, one of the most prestigious journals in which a paper can be published. And basically this is what they're showing in their figure here, that they would get the liver and they would infuse these organoids, where you can see you can't see my hand, but the sort of middle top figure, they're infusing their cholangiocyte organoids, their organoids, into that biliary tree. But then what they showed was that if they measured, and they had a certain marker on those organoids that would let them know if the organoids are present or absent, right? And so in that sort of slightly inscrutable graph where you can see a sort of a red peak and a blue peak, what they're showing is that not only could they infuse these cells into an otherwise diseased liver, but when they measured, so they knew how many they were pumping in, right? But when they measured what was coming out on the other end, right, they showed that all of the cells that they were infusing, or at least most of them, were integrated into the liver, meaning that there was effective integration. And so basically what they showed beyond that is that they were able to restore the function of previously dysfunctional bile ducts. And so what this means is that for a lot of people who, otherwise for whom the only solution available is a liver transplant, this could potentially be an alternative. And I have to imagine, they haven't conducted any of these surgeries in people, but I have to imagine that this procedure would be significantly less invasive, because you're not transplanting an entire organ. I have to imagine it would also be quite a bit cheaper and simpler, and probably the recovery from which would be significantly less severe, right? Because I have to imagine that most of the surgery could be done laparoscopically, like with little sort of fiber optic-y kind of cameras. So this is actually like a really big deal. The liver isn't necessarily the sexiest of organs, but it's really impressive, and it's the first overtly clinical therapeutic application of organoids that I've seen to date. So this is a cool story, and I'm really looking forward to seeing not only what they do next, like if they actually go to prime time and actually try it in some patients, but other potential clinical applications of organoid-based cells. It could be a huge game changer, and it could reduce a lot of human suffering. So it's a really cool story, really cool study, and I'm sorry I couldn't prep it a little bit more thoroughly for you today. Maybe we'll talk about it again in the future. But otherwise, why don't we start the live half and see what we can talk about today. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, I briefly talked about a new discovery, a new procedure that could potentially reduce the need for a huge proportion of liver transplants. So about a third of liver transplants in adults are due to dysfunctional bile ducts. And about 70% of liver transplant causes in children are due to the same thing, due to dysfunctional bile ducts. And so what this group did was use organoids to essentially rescue the function of previously dysfunctional bile ducts. To be clear, they were working with a liver derived from a donor, but the liver was deemed unsuitable for transplant because of these disrupted bile duct function. And so this could be potentially quite significant and dramatically improve the lives of tons and tons of people. This was a study that was conducted in Cambridge, or at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. It was a huge team also, by the way. Tons and tons of scientists and physicians were involved in this effort. And it's published in Science, in case you're interested in trying to check it out. And there are some like articles that are, public press articles that cover it. It's pretty impressive. Like, they basically showed that they could grow these organoids, right? Organoids, again, are like sort of mini versions of organs, right? Where you can sort of grow an organoid version of a brain or of a liver, but pretty much any kind of organ. Which brings up a whole bunch of interesting philosophical questions. Like, for example, if you're growing an organoid of a brain organoid, at what point, and they can get big enough that you can like see them. It's not like, see them with your eyes. It's not like these are like, they need to be super microscopic. But at what point does an organoid that you're growing in a petri dish, essentially in a test tube, at what level of complexity do we start to think about it having consciousness? I think that it's not as big of a problem as might be intuitive, but yeah, so this is the first time I've seen organoid technology used for like a clinical therapeutic application. And so exciting stuff. And yeah, actually, the last time I talked about this study, there was somebody who had a 2-year-old who just had to undergo a liver transplant due to disrupted bile duct function. And so like literally that kid could potentially have avoided having to undergo a transplant. And so, yeah. But what's also exciting, beyond just Legolas, I was just playing Lord of the Rings in the background last night while doing some work. What's also pretty exciting about this is, this is just one very narrow specific application of organoids. And so to what other diseased conditions could organoids be applied? Could be potentially quite expansive, or the list could be quite expansive. could involve more than just sort of, like liver disease and stuff like that. And so, so that's pretty exciting. And so usually on Sundays, I like to prepare a study, and I know I'm repeating myself, like I literally just said this on YouTube, but I usually like to prepare a story or study and talk about it in greater depth. But I'm working on this project for my new job that does not have to do with science directly. Might have to do with like post-traumatic stress disorder and aggressive human behavior, I suppose, violent human behavior, and arguably maybe sociopathic or psychopathic behavior. But this project has sort of consumed like all of my time, and because I'm sort of stepping outside of my domain of expertise. Though I have to acknowledge that training in science did prepare me a bit for being able to collect evidence, and so yeah. Hey Elise, good to see you. Good afternoon. Hope your days are going well. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of rainy. Today's one of those days where you just sort of wake up and you feel like you're sitting in a container of concrete. You're just like, ugh. But that's because I was up pretty late last night working on this project. Yeah, so it's a new, I mean, it's a new job, Jack, but it's new as of the past several months, so it's not that new. Yeah, I'm basically working as a science advisor to a state government. That's not technically what my title is, to be clear, but the title is, I guess you would say, policy analyst. But so as a result, I end up engaging topics that have to do more with like people's day-to-day lives, and in this case, people in prison, their day-to-day lives. So yeah, so sorry, apologies, I couldn't really prepare this in as great of depth as I would have liked to, but next week, I promise. So, some pretty good news here in the United States, fairly in the past couple days. The FDA has approved emergency use for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is pretty awesome. That could be a different game changer, just given the fact that it's significantly much easier to transport the J&J vaccine. Though we did hear Pfizer did apply for the permission to be able to transport their vaccine, an mRNA vaccine, at much higher temperatures than initially anticipated. So we're talking temperatures like much closer to sort of like normal freezers, as opposed to super duper freezing like -80 Fahrenheit. All right, what's the best way to use the full potential of the brain? Solar synthesis. That's a pretty simple question. No big deal, right? How hard could it be? No, that's a fabulous thing to consider. So the human brain is arguably, well, it is the most complicated organ on the planet. Arguably also the most versatile. And there you can think of the purpose of the brain in multiple ways, but one way to think about it is that it's sort of like a versatility engine or an adaptation engine, right? And because it is responsible for not only regulating your behavior, your consciousness, your cognition, your memory, your emotional experiences, but also just your body. It's fairly complicated, and so the best way to maximize the potential of the human brain is to ensure that it's healthy, and ensure that it gets adequate distributions of nutrients and vitamins and minerals, micronutrients, macronutrients, and sleep, and that you avoid severe trauma, right, as you can, right? But so let's speak a little bit more practically. So that first issue, just ensuring that you're sort of sculpting a kind of a healthy landscape for the brain, that's probably the most critical. So, we know that, for example, sleep deficits have very significant ramifications for, cognitive function, for pretty much everything. I mean, including mood. Sleep deficits can be associated with increased risks of dementia, or it is, not can be, but is. And cognitive performance deteriorates when you have a sleep deficit. And, it's one of those things that I suspect we, generally speaking, underestimate. And so get enough sleep. That's A number one. And get enough nutritious sleep. And I say nutritious and sleep. How can sleep be nutritious? You're not eating sleep. Well, think about it this way, right? If let's say you're getting, 8 hours of sleep, but every night before you go to bed, you have some alcohol. Well, alcohol has been, confidently demonstrated to disrupt the sort of healthy transition between the various stages of sleep. And so, as you're falling asleep, you go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3/4. Some argue that there's no such thing as a stage 4 of sleep, but whatever, 3/4, and then REM sleep, and then rinse, wash, and repeat. And then you go back to stage 1, and this whole progression continues. These cycles continue. And so pretty much every psychoactive drug will influence that progression. And so that's what I mean by, getting nutrition, not just enough sleep, but nutritious sleep. Okay, next one, nutrition, actual nutrition, dietary nutrition. There's an argument in good faith among various biomedical scientists as to which diet is optimal. Broadly speaking, to summarize a pretty contentious debate, broadly speaking, I think the majority consensus is some version of the Mediterranean diet or the MIND diet, which is sort of a manipulation or an iteration of the Mediterranean diet that also integrates sort of controlling sodium levels, and it does not call for red wine. The Mediterranean diet does include a glass of red wine every now and then. And so, a way to simplify this, perhaps, would be we know that various diseases and disorders that are associated with the brain can be associated with high intake of simple carbohydrates, in other words, sugar. And so essentially there is no good reason to consume simple carbohydrates unless you're like a peak performance athlete where you really need the availability of those carbohydrates to burn, to generate ATP, but the vast majority of us are not. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly not a peak performance athlete. And so, apart from it just tasting delicious, right? And it's always nice to be able to, experience some of the lovely aspects of, our sensorium. The potential for our sensory experiences. There's really no justification to consume, no healthy reason to consume simple carbohydrates. And then also there's pretty solid evidence. Now this is a little bit more contentious, but there's pretty solid evidence that consumption of high amounts of saturated fats. So think, any fat that's solid at room temperature. So think butter, think animal-based fats. High consumption of that can be associated with various diseases and disorders that can affect the brain. That's contentious. There's definitely an argument, again, in good faith, that we are overly demonizing saturated fats, and there's a very interesting history as to why it is that, at least in the United States, saturated fats became the enemy, and every fad diet was about, eliminating fat from your diet. And lo and behold, we had a spike in diabetes because now everybody was just eating a ton of carbohydrates. But anyways, I think, again, the broad consensus would be minimizing levels of saturated fats. Again, butter, animal fats is prudent. And I could go on. There's more and more, but I mean, broadly speaking, what you're thinking, the way I approach diet, at least, is to have a competent distribution, like a coherent, competent distribution of macronutrients, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, and micronutrients, which, generally speaking, you can derive pretty effectively from green leafy vegetables. Generally speaking, like your one sort of cheat code is if you make a salad or you make a stir fry or something, you're cooking a bunch of veggies, just include a bunch of different colors, right? Like have, some red vegetables, green ones, light green ones, dark green ones, that's a sort of cheat code that you can apply because you can be certain that there will be some differences in the micronutrients, again, the vitamins, the minerals that are present in these vegetables. And then, of course, the last one that I'll get into is exposing your brain to new challenges, right? Learning new things. So we know there's plenty of evidence now at this point that individuals who have higher educational attainment, meaning they just stayed in school for longer, tend to exhibit a less rapid development of dementia if they do develop dementia. And there's just a bunch of reduced mild cognitive impairment, which we all experience as we get older. Educational attainment is just like a convenient way to quantify people who are, are experiencing cognitive challenges for a longer period of time. In other words, you don't have to like be in school for this benefit to derive this benefit. Just exposing your brain to new challenges, forcing yourself to solve new problems, exposing yourself to ideas with which you might disagree, but you have to think, hey, why do I disagree, right? Reading books is a great way to do that, but you don't only have to be reading books, right? Just exposing yourself to new information, to new challenging information, is generally speaking, that's how you're going to get the biggest performance bang for your buck. And there's a bunch of other ones too. There's like avoiding social isolation. Social isolation is very consistently associated with an increased risk of cognitive impairment as we get older. And that's an unfortunate problem because at least in this country, in the United States, but I'm sure internationally as well, we have an issue where as people get older, it's easier and easier for them to become socially isolated. There's just not as many venues for the social interaction that people my age and younger and a bit older regularly take for granted, regularly experience. So avoiding social isolation, I would put up there. Of course, exercise, cardiovascular exercise in particular, but exercise in general, periodically every week. Great idea. More recently has been associated with, again, reduced risk of dementia and cognitive impairment as we get older. So we're talking about a frequency of something like 20 to 30 minutes of, moderate intensity. It depends on your age regarding what kind, like the intensity of the exercise that's recommended. Like if you're, over the age of 65, the recommendation is different than if you're 25, right? But, broadly speaking, forcing your cardiovascular system to, get off its butt and work a bit. In other words, to experience sweating due to exercise. That's another sort of like easy way to do this if you don't like monitor your heart and stuff like that. If you're sweating, that means your cardiovascular system is working. Generally speaking, assuming that you're not like in a sauna or something, if you're sweating while you're exercising, that means your cardiovascular system is getting a workout. And so those things, I think, are the ways to maximize the potential of the human brain. Apart from that, I'm sure you were probably more interested in like, hey, are there any substances that can enhance performance? And I'm happy to go into that if you would like. But let's check something else out. So why do I have bad dreams every night? Why do I have bad dreams so often? So I'm going to assume your name is, Kaylee's. So dreams are extraordinarily interesting, right? They are a phenomenon that has sort of vexed scientists and philosophers for literally thousands of years. Aristotle wrote a book on, what was it? Yeah, I think it was Aristotle wrote a book on essentially lucid dreaming. Aristotle. So that goes back a tick, right? And so the reality is when it comes to dreams, we don't actually know for sure why it is we have dreams and how it is we have dreams, but we have some pretty good ideas as to why. And so let's get into that. So first of all, we are pretty sure that most dreams occur when you're sleeping, by the way. Most dreams occur during a phase of your sleep cycle, which I mentioned earlier, called REM, stands for rapid eye movement. And this is the sort of terminal phase of a sleep cycle, and you have many, if you're doing it right, you have many sleep cycles over the course of the night, where patterns of activity in the brain more closely resemble what they look like when you're awake. They're not identical, and there's some very important differences that we'll talk about in just a second, but your patterns of brain activity are far more similar to what your brain looks like when it's awake than what's called slow wave sleep, the periods of the sleep cycle that precede REM. Okay, and so basically as you're sort of descending into your sort of sleep cycle, patterns of brain activity begin to become slower and less frequent. And then all of a sudden you hit REM, and then it's like chaos again. And then it's, this whole, it's like the symphony just woke up. And so the main exception that I think is most relevant, at least to lucid dreaming, is that for the vast majority of the time when we're dreaming, there's reduced activity in what's called the frontal lobe or frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex in particular. However, every now and then, for whatever reason, in some cases, activity in the frontal lobes, in the prefrontal cortex, begins to increase. And that is very unusual, and that, generally speaking, is what's associated with lucid dreaming. Now, what determines whether or not a dream is a good dream or a bad dream, a good dream or a nightmare? That's a harder question to address. However, I think we can speculate pretty responsibly here. So we know that patterns of brain activity during REM can be influenced by the previous day's experience. more specifically, there's this pattern of brain activity called PGO waves. I think it's pontine, geniculate, occipital waves. I believe it's geniculate, but basically these are just like waves of activity that cycle from basically the brainstem to, that and involve the occipital lobe, which is where the visual cortex is. And so it turns out that if somebody had a day that had a lot of novelty in it, a lot of unusual experiences that are new, the frequency of those PGO waves increases. You have more of them. And there are a whole bunch of theories as to what role dreams might play. I think most of them are kind of reaching a little bit for coherence where there need not be any coherence. In other words, an explanation that makes sense where there doesn't necessarily have to be an explanation that makes intuitive sense. But one of the theories that I think is sort of widely appreciated, and you probably think of dreams in this way too, is that dreams occur such that sort of as a rehearsal, okay? And so that is a very functional interpretation of what a neuroscientist would probably say, which would be that as we know that the patterns of brain activity when somebody's asleep after a day full of novelty change, then perhaps one of the functional consequences of having dreams, having REM sleep brain activity, is that it's sort of like rehearsal in that the brain is sort of automatically revisiting patterns of brain activity that happened during the prior day. And so, it's not necessarily a rehearsal, but it's just sort of reinforcing and revisiting those patterns of brain activity. Okay. And so, it doesn't have to be like this specific, but like, imagine the previous day you went skydiving, right? For the first time. I've never been skydiving. That would be a very novel experience for me. I'm probably never going to go skydiving, by the way. It seems totally insane to me, but, theoretically you're going to have a whole pattern of brain activity that never would have happened, previously. So totally new patterns of brain activity will occur. And so when you fall asleep, as this theory would stipulate, there's an increased likelihood that you will experience maybe flying sensations or a visual experience of very rapidly moving components of your visual field, right? But also, skydiving is extraordinarily arousing, anxiogenic, right? Sort of scary, fight or flight inducing experience. And so there's likely to be escalations of certain hormones and certain neurochemicals that are associated with anxiety, that are associated with fight or flight. And theoretically, and so now we're really stepping into speculation territory, when it comes to a nightmare, let's say that somebody was mugged, right? Was robbed, maybe violently during the previous day, right? It's not an activity you elected to engage, right? You're not like skydiving. And that's extremely violating. It's extremely, it can be quite traumatizing. So that experience now has escalated a whole bunch of signaling in regions of the brain that are associated with fight or flight and anxiety and fear. And so as you go to sleep, that elevated, those elevated levels of activity in those brain regions, elevated levels of certain neurochemicals, hormones and stuff, arguably will either remain elevated or because of that automatic, process of revisiting the previous day's experience, you'll re-experience some version. It doesn't have to be identical. It doesn't have to be the same thing, but some, anxiogenic, some fear-inducing experience, just because, you're turning on certain brain regions that are associated with fear, anxiety, and so on. Now, I suspect that, generally speaking, excluding some particularly unlucky people, every day isn't necessarily traumatic, right? But we know, independently of sleep, we know that somebody who's experienced severe trauma can develop a syndrome, a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, where the sort of the footprint of that trauma remains for a while. Essentially, the brain is learning from that experience, and because it was so traumatic. One way to think about it, the functional interpretation, is that the brain, evolved to ensure that you will never experience that traumatic experience again. And so every experience you have is filtered through that past trauma. And so, in other words, that the effects of that trauma can linger for a very, very long time. And so, one could imagine that, given that fact, that when somebody who's experienced trauma of some sort goes to sleep, and that, again, that automatic activation of patterns brain activity occurs during REM sleep, there's an increased predisposition to experiencing nightmares, experiencing aversive experiences while you're asleep. So that's a lot of that's definitely some established neuroscience, but that last part is definitely speculation, but I bet I'm not too far off. And so, yeah, I never met a carb I didn't like, Betty says. Yeah. I'm a fat and salt guy. That's, I could just like drink A1 sauce. It's ridiculous. What are we talking about, Dan? Whatever you want. Today it's just a day. I unfortunately didn't have enough time to prepare a topic, but we can talk about whatever you'd like. I do take gabapentin and tramadol for pain. Okay. For pain, which it looks like part of your comment was chopped off. Sorry about that, Lucky Red. So gabapentin is an interesting, these are both interesting medications. So gabapentin is essentially, it's a pretty simple molecule actually, but you can think of it as being, so the neurotransmitter GABA, this is the reason that they named it gabapentin. The neurotransmitter GABA is the nervous system's principal off neurotransmitter. When GABA is released and a neuron picks it up, binds a neuron's receptor, it's that neuron is less likely to fire an impulse. So it sort of calms down activity throughout the brain, but particularly where there are GABA receptors. And so, so there's a bunch of different medications that can do this. Benzodiazepines, probably most widely used version of this, alprazolam or Xanax, diazepam or Valium, essentially anything that ends in azepam, has that effect because it amplifies or increases GABAergic activity, GABA-related activity. So when it comes to gabapentin, and it's important to note that GABA receptors are present not only throughout the brain and the central nervous system, but also the body. And so gabapentin can be used for a variety of things. It can be used, as it seems in your case, it has been shown that at least for some folks, gabapentin can be helpful in moderating chronic pain. And can enable the use of lower doses of opioids to achieve a therapeutic effect, which is very useful. Tramadol is an interesting substance. Tramadol is a synthetic opioid, not derived from the opium poppy, so it's not an opiate. But it not only binds the same receptor that morphine, oxycodone, fentanyl bind, the mu-opioid receptors. However, it also is a serotonin releasing agent or a monoamine releasing agent, meaning that it has a whole other sort of domain of its pharmacological activity. And so as a result, it has sort of some slight nuances in its effects, right? So to be a little bit more practical, some people, when they experience, when they're prescribed hydrocodone in Vicodin or oxycodone or OxyContin or Percocet, they can feel really drowsy and sort of, lethargic and tired. And a lot of people don't like the effects of those medications because of that. And so tramadol can have some slight stimulant effects. And so it can be useful in those cases. And so, good luck with the treatment of your pain. Okay, let's talk about weed. Of course, yeah, we can talk about weed, no problem. Am I right in saying coronavirus is the strain, but COVID are the complications? So sort of. So SARS coronavirus 2 is the virus itself, right? It is the thing that causes the disease called COVID-19. Now, there are different strains of SARS coronavirus 2. And as we're seeing, they're cropping up more and more because the longer a virus is able to linger in its host species, essentially, the longer that people have COVID-19 and people are catching the virus, and therefore the virus is capable of replicating within the body in a wide range of compartments of the body, by the way, wider than we thought, wider than a lot of respiratory viruses. The longer that happens, the more opportunities there are for a mutation to occur. So instead of, viruses, just like humans, right? Whenever genetic material is replicated, is synthesized, there's an opportunity for a mistake. Generally speaking, like in human biology, those mistakes are pretty infrequent. They can happen every now and then, and generally speaking, there's no actual major consequence for them, but sometimes a mutation can occur, a mistake in the replication of DNA, and then therefore you develop a cancer or something like that. So same thing can happen with viruses. Some viruses mutate and generate new strains more rapidly than others. So most, probably widely appreciated version of this is the influenza virus. It mutates all the time. And so that's why there's no like singular vaccine for the flu, because, that vaccine is going to be only effective on, this season's influenza virus strain, and next year there's going to be multiple other strains, and there's a whole science to trying to predict what those strains will be. It's actually a really interesting and impressive science, and they get it right very, very frequently, but you can't get it right every time. So when it comes to COVID-19, it doesn't mutate quite as much as a virus like the influenza virus, because it has what's called proofreading capabilities. Don't worry about it, but it still can mutate, right? Like all viruses can. And so as a result, you have multiple strains of SARS coronavirus 2. So we've heard of the B117 strain from the United Kingdom. They have another one over there in the United Kingdom. They have the South Africa strain. These are not necessarily where these mutations, these strains of SARS coronavirus 2 emerge, but it's where they were identified. And there's one now in California that's been identified that seems to be similarly more aggressive, more contagious. And so we have multiple strains of SARS coronavirus 2, all of which cause COVID-19. Fat is essential for the brain. Yeah, absolutely. Can I count this as brain exercise? What is raw poapor? I'm not familiar with that. Hey, what's up, goddess? Goddess Elixir. Goddess Elixir, I assume. Is there any benefit from ginkgo biloba to help brain functioning? How will I know it's working? Yeah, maybe EDAS. Excellent question. And ginkgo biloba is in that category of I guess supplements still that has been alluring to scientists for generations. And so there, it's also the effects of something like ginkgo biloba are almost always going to be rather subtle. And so that means two things, right? That has two consequences. First, it's probably going to be very difficult for you to know if it's doing anything at all. But second, it can be very, very difficult for any beneficial effect to be measured, to be observed by scientists, because when you have such a subtle effect, if there's an effect at all, you need to study so many people in just the right way, right? Maybe it is that ginkgo biloba doesn't really have any beneficial effects, except for it actually has some minor benefit for, verbal recall or for reaction time. But it's just so on the tail. It's like so minor that, to be able to detect that effect, you need to study tens and tens of thousands of people. And those are just hard studies to do. And it's difficult to justify doing those studies when the effects of something are so subtle, as opposed to studying something that might be therapeutic, might cure Alzheimer's disease or whatever, right? But there are studies, like any substance in this kind of category of sort of supplements derived from maybe traditional medicine, that you can definitely find studies that do identify some kind of beneficial effect. Most of the studies I've seen do not. And so there's sort of sparse evidence that it can reduce the development of dementia. But what was interesting about this study that I'm referencing right now, and keep in mind, I read this study years ago at this point. What was interesting about this study, which is kind of baffling, was that this team did identify a beneficial effect of ginkgo on, for dementia, but it seemed to have a time of day dependence. It seemed to matter at what time of day somebody took their ginkgo biloba, which is just it's very interesting, frankly. But it's not the kind of thing that you would anticipate, right? For me, I don't think that the effects are substantial enough to warrant spending your funds, your finances, devoting your attention to ginkgo biloba, as opposed to maybe ensuring that you have a more competent diet, making sure that you're eating sources of macro and micronutrients that are more sort of diverse than I think is the standard diet. But I've also, to be fair, I've never seen any evidence that it's dangerous, that it has any kind of negative, deleterious effect on health. So, it's sort of in that category of does it help? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not for most people, but it couldn't hurt. It's not necessarily dangerous. So that's where I must leave you in terms of your decision making there. Hey Frank, talk of keeping brain active, stimulated cognition is so important, and you do a great job of reinforcing it. Parent is elderly, and seeing the dramatic effect seems needless. Yeah. Dementia is one of those conditions that I think is the most among the most devastating, just because it's one of these things where you don't see any overt change in the person, right? You don't see, it's not like they've lost a hand, right? Or it's not like, they need to do dialysis all the time, right? It's subtler than that. But what deteriorates is like the things that are the most important about somebody whom you love deeply, right? Their ability to remember who you are, their ability to have a conversation with you. Oftentimes dementia can also be associated with increased aggression or just frustration, agitation, which is obviously unpleasant for everybody, most notably the person who's suffering from dementia, but also family members, right? And so, yeah, I'm sorry to hear that you're dealing with that. It runs in on one side of my family at least. Can I count this? Yeah, as exercise. Why does it feel like psilocybin made my brain feel like it was operating at full potential? Well, solar synthesis, that's you are not alone in acknowledging this kind of an effect, this sort of sensation, this perception that when under the influence of not just psilocybin, people say this about a lot of psychedelic hallucinogens. However, it's important to also acknowledge that that realization, right, or that experience, that perception that you are operating at full potential, or you are somehow optimized, that is the byproduct of a whole collection of emotional experiences and literally like the detection of profundity, right? There's a region of our brain, or there's a circuit within our brain that is literally devoted to determining whether an experience you're having is very profound, is life-changing, is important, is worthy of storage, right? Is worthy of being remembered. And so a lot of drugs have been shown to be able to manipulate that, to make everything seem profound, make everything seem, important. Probably infamously, or most infamously, would be cannabis, right? Where everything is so cool, and you'll hear stories from comedians who, write jokes while they're stoned, and they thought everything was so hilarious and such a great idea, and then the next day when they're sober, they're just like, this is ridiculous. Not necessarily, and that's not an effect that's unique to cannabis, and it's not necessarily always wrong, right? You're just amplifying the likelihood that you will determine that something is profound just across the board. And it's very likely that you will have some kind of profound experience, right? So it's not necessarily always wrong, but it is important to note that this is a component of your consciousness that is sensitive to being influenced by substances. And psychedelics most definitely, modulate that experience. That said, and also, as I said, there's also a mood and emotional component to that, right? Where it feels good to feel like you're operating at full potential. But, I think it's worth acknowledging that people who find opioids like, oxycodone or heroin or, hydrocodone, etc., people that find them potentially addictive, find them euphoric, and they feel good when they're under the influence of those substances. Not everybody does. But in fact, the majority seem to not. But for those who do, you will regularly, and I've had conversations on this platform with people who are being treated with oxycodone for a surgery of some sort, and literally they have said I've never felt better. I've never felt more normal. I feel like I'm more effective. I feel like I'm more I can't remember the specific terms he used in this specific case that I'm thinking of. His name was Mike. I do remember that, and he lived in California. I remember that. But it was sort of like, generally speaking, the types of things that you're suggesting. I feel normal. I feel like I'm more competent, and so but those are opioids. They have nothing to do with or not nothing, but they have a completely different pharmacological effect. They bind the mu-opioid receptor, whereas psychedelic hallucinogens like psilocybin, LSD, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, they bind serotonin receptors primarily, also modify serotonin signaling, the signaling of the neurotransmitter itself. But what so there are some common features across those two totally disparate pharmacological categories of drugs. but they both are known to elevate mood, to make you feel generally better. There's recordings of like some of the first studies that were done on members of the military with LSD, and basically, and you can read the notes. There's a great book called Poisoner in Chief by Stephen, can't remember his last name, Kinzer, Stephen Kinzer, and he's I think a journalism professor at Brown University. And basically, this is a book about Sidney Gottlieb, who was the sort of head chemist of the CIA for a long time, and involved in MK Ultra, involved in Operation Midnight Climax, in I think Operation Artichoke was another one that was very fun, and he basically was responsible for getting all of the CIA's LSD. And it was basically all of Sandoz Pharmaceuticals LSD. Anyways, you can see like some of the notes that were taken by the people who were observing these members of the military or members of the CIA, in some cases who were dosed without knowing, which is crazy. But basically, they some of the notes are like, it definitely induces laughter, right? Like, and it's classic, right? When, the onset of effects of LSD or psilocybin, people can just begin giggling and like they just feel good. It's an elevated the experience of elevated mood. And so, with a combination of sort of triggering your sort of profundity detector, right, where everything is just more likely to be detected as profound or determined to be profound and remembered. And of course the novelty of the experience, but then also just the elevation of mood, the likelihood that you're going to feel like the thoughts you're having are, or there's an increased likelihood that you will, perceive the thoughts you experience, the cognition you experience, the realizations you experience as being profound, as being novel, certainly. And so all of this to say, this long response, all of this to say that I would caution you against assigning performance-enhancing capabilities to a substance. It's not necessarily incorrect, but the issue, and I think it's been pretty confidently established that, psilocybin in particular has some potential clinical benefits. And then there's, of course, the whole topic of microdosing that is very interesting that I've talked about on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. But I would caution you against perceiving any kind of optimization of the brain as being completely attributable to a substance, as opposed to what you're doing when you're under the influence of that substance. And so yeah, I mean, I think if you were a member of my family, right, and we were having this conversation, I would urge you to just learn from those experiences and not necessarily assume that, any kind of, optimization of brain activity or of your consciousness only occurs when exposed to psilocybin, right? When exposed to a specific substance. But your mileage may vary, Okay, my child has tardive dyskinesia from medication since 2012. Anything that will help? I'm sorry to hear that, Julie. Yeah, so for anybody that's unfamiliar, tardive dyskinesia is essentially involuntary muscle activation. And so, it can be associated with a variety of things, but, certain medications are certainly known to induce tardive dyskinesia. A lot of medications that are used to treat psychosis or schizophrenia, or not a lot of them, but some of them can be associated with tardive dyskinesia. As far as I'm aware, there's no easy solution, assuming that somebody requires that medication for a long period of time. Because it's the medication itself that's inducing it, it's very difficult to mitigate without reducing the dose of the medication. One perhaps source of optimism is that while it is very it can be debilitating, it can be obviously very frustrating. I've never seen any evidence that it's actually damaging, that it's actually like that this is a byproduct of any kind of damage to the nervous system. And if it's medication induced, it is therefore, it will go away, once medication is no longer being taken. And so, I think, again, if you were in my family, my source of optimism would be, neuroscience, pharmacology, psychiatry. I don't know for what condition your son is being medicated, but sorry. Feel free to call back in. I just tried to to add you, Mohammed. These fields are constantly looking and working towards developing more effective medications for conditions that currently only have a couple medications available. Speaking of medications, there's a very cool company that I just saw that is in Los Angeles, I believe, called Bionautic Technologies, I think. And this came up last week, I think, where the use of nanotechnology in medicine. There's a lot of exaggeration or a lot of loose speculation and arguably just lying, misinformation about the use of nanotechnology in medications. But this company is working on exactly what I brought up in response, where generally speaking, when we're talking about nanotech in medicine, what we're talking about are devices that enable medication to be delivered to a specific part of the body at a specific time. And so, this company, what they have are basically these little vessels that are sensitive to magnetic fields. And so they can guide these little vessels, and they look like tiny little capsules, right? And they can guide them through like the central nervous system, through the spine essentially, to a certain part of the brain, and then upon arrival cause the payload to be delivered, cause the vessel to drop its packages, right? And then they can remove it just as easily. And what's nice is that you don't need like super crazy powerful magnets to guide this activity. Like it's less powerful magnets than in an MRI. So that's pretty cool. But that would be amazing for conditions like cancer, right? Where there's so many off-target effects of the medications that need to be used to kill cancerous cells. And so if rather than having to just expose whole areas of the body or the entire body to certain chemotherapeutic agents or medications, you could just very precisely deliver those medications, that could fundamentally change the experience of having to undergo treatment for cancer. Okay. I live with trauma-induced agoraphobia and PTSD. Call my dreams are anxious, like in waking life. Yeah. It doesn't surprise me. Sorry to hear that. At least I wouldn't have known that from interacting with you. Why does chocolate release same chemicals as sex in the brain, and how does weed affect the brain? Shiloh, great topics. So first of all, when you say chocolate doesn't necessarily release the same neurochemicals as sex, and I assume when you're saying sex, I assume you mean orgasm. There will be some similarities, but that's largely because you could say that they're the same neurochemicals that are released when somebody smokes a cigarette or has a drink of alcohol or does any kind of rewarding drug, or snuggles, right? Just snuggles with somebody they love, or they're just around somebody they love. They're around their children, their baby, their spouse. And so it's not like there is this unusual connection between chocolate and orgasm or sex. Okay. But what about that overlap? What's the deal? Why do all of these things overlap in addition to chocolate and sex? Well, it's because, there's a reason that all of these things are rewarding or hedonically pleasurable, that they feel good and that, you want to do them more, right? It's because the same systems in the brain are activated upon exposure to all of them. And so, if cocaine didn't induce elevations of dopamine in a certain circuit of the brain called the Mesocortical Limbic Dopaminergic circuit, most importantly the Mesolimbic circuit, where you have some ancient neurons, basically right where the brainstem meets the cerebrum, the bigger part of the brain, that produce dopamine. They send dopamine all the way, very close to the front of the brain, or much further towards the front of the brain, area called the ventral striatum, or the nucleus accumbens, in case you're curious. If cocaine didn't induce that elevation of dopamine levels, people wouldn't take it. Similarly, if any kind of food that doesn't induce some kind of hedonic pleasure when you eat it, you're far less likely to eat it, right? It's because you won't experience that reward, that hedonic pleasure from a delicious food. And so why eat it then? And so same goes when it comes to chocolate, of course, right? Because it's sweet most specifically, and it has some interesting, unique flavors to it as well. Now, there is an interesting effect, pseudo-pharmacological effect of chocolate that has been shown. And that is that it does seem to regulate in some way the estrogen receptor. And this is sort of like, oh my gosh, are you serious? You know, that's why women love chocolate. Women aren't the only people that love chocolate. I love chocolate, you know. And so, but you know, there is this interesting effect that, you know, there has been this interaction that's been identified, but that is not unique to chocolate or sex. And so, but that's the main reason why. Okay. So how does weed affect the brain? Weed is very, very complicated. Cannabis is very complicated. Weed has, you know, depending on you know what kind of scientist you're talking to, has dozens, if not over 100 different cannabinoids. So and yeah, we can talk about ayahuasca after this. So cannabinoids, most famous is of course tetrahydrocannabinol, delta 9 THC. But there are other ones: cannabigerol, cannabichromine, of course cannabidiol, CBD, experiencing a sort of a very popular moment. And they all, well, not all of them, but THC and CBD are probably the most, you know, pharmacologically consequential. Although there is evidence that like cannabigerol and cannabichromine, these other cannabinoids that you probably have never heard of, can influence the pharmacologies of THC and CBD. So it's not like they're inert. It's not like they're not doing anything. And that, by the way, may be part of the reason for why people who have a tolerance to cannabis can sort of distinguish effects between different strains, where you have, you know, a sativa strain that is more sort of stimulating and inducing of you know, creativity and mania in some cases, whereas you have an indica strain that is sort of induces couch lock, induces sedation, anxiolysis, reduced anxiety, and then you have, you know, the sort of kaffir stanicas. I don't know if people still use that term, but the diesel strains, you know, unique effects. Skunks have unique effects and stuff like that. So that might be why, because there's always going to be differences in the spectra of these different chemicals, like how much THC, how much CBD, but then also how much of these other molecules, that both other cannabinoids, but also other molecules like terpenes and stuff like that generate the sort of flavor characteristics and the odorant characteristics of cannabis, you know. Those all also seem to have some kind of a subtle pharmacological consequence of their presence. Okay, so, but, you know, the most important, the main effect, the main ingredients of cannabis are THC and CBD. THC is the sort of main psychoactive component of cannabis. And what THC does is it binds cannabinoid receptors in our brain and throughout our body. Cannabinoid receptors are G protein coupled receptors, in case you were interested. These are very big receptors that do big things. And they're some of the most widely expressed receptors in our nervous system. And as a result of that, well, and so what they sort of do, you know, they're not the kind of receptor where when it's activated, something immediately happens. Something immediately, you know, a neuron fires an impulse, or an action potential, as we call them, or, you know, or prevents a neuron from firing an impulse. They're more sort of like, you know, background influencers, right? It's as opposed to like if you're looking at a painting, like the characters in the front where you can see in the foreground, you know, you're seeing the dude stabbing the other dude in like a Renaissance, you know, tapestry or something like that. They're more the sort of the background, the ambiance cannabinoids. But they regulate, because cannabinoid receptors, which again are the receptors to which THC and CBD, but THC bind, because they're so widely expressed, they regulate such a wide variety of things. And that's why you get effects of cannabis that are unique to cannabis, but then also are shared with other substances. Like they have some slightly psychedelic effects. Color perception is a little bit enhanced, or not enhanced, but altered. And, you know, you can get some sort of subtle psychedelic types of hallucinations. You know, again, very, very subtle compared to actual, you know, like LSD or whatever. But also cannabis will influence, you know, sleep, will influence, you know, energy, whatever you want to call it, will influence mood, of course, will influence appetite infamously, it will influence, you know, vasodynamics, you know, the activities of blood vessels, because cannabinoid receptors regulate so many different things. But so that's what happens. And one of the other unique, you know, somewhat unique characteristics of THC is that it is fat soluble, which is why when somebody cooks with cannabis, so it's usually in a fat of some sort or something that has fat in it, brownies, butter, these types of things. But as a result, if somebody's been consuming cannabis for a long time, their adipose tissue, their fatty tissue, will have cannabinoids in them, right? And so that is the reason for why somebody can test positive for cannabis for such a long period of time, for weeks and weeks and weeks, depending on, you know, how long somebody's been consuming it, because there's sort of like this slow release effect of cannabinoids from their adipose tissue. But you know, after one inhalation, let's say, of cannabis, if you're smoking it, you know, cannabinoids are THC, etc., are absorbed by the alveoli into your blood, and then very rapidly get into your brain, bind the receptors, etc., and then eventually they're you know, metabolized and excreted, and you are probably asleep by then. Okay. Any experience with taste buds? Any recommendations on how to change them? Oh, we lose them as we age. Or do we lose them as we age? Yeah. So definitely taste perception, olfaction, and gustation, or the gustatory system, they definitely change as we get older. And if I remember correctly, you know, we have, as many are aware now, we have, you know, 4 different principal tastes, right? If I remember correctly, like salt, for example, deteriorates more rapidly than the others. I'm reaching through some cobwebs there through my, you know, my memory. But how do we change them, though? That is an interesting topic. There is a substance that has been around for a very long time, but it doesn't seem to be as like widely explored as I would think it would be, called miracle berry. And and I didn't know this when I tried it, but there are different sort of sources of this substance that induces a sort of radical, it's like an olfactory or gustatory hallucination, right? Where all of a sudden things that are extraordinarily bitter taste sweet. And, you know, everything will taste slightly differently. And so, and I've tried this, I think 2 times. And it's true, lemons were just like starburst. They were so my mouth is watering just thinking about that experience, because it was so good. And you can get miracle berry on, you know, Amazon. It's totally legal. It's not like a scheduled substance. And basically, it's like a tablet that you rub on the surface of your tongue, and you leave it there for a while, and then you just have fun. And so when I was in grad school, when I was in Houston, Texas, but then also here, I would have friends over and we would try it. We would like cut up a whole bunch of veggies, you know, like, you know, bell peppers that are, you know, sort of bitter and you know, not super sweet, but, you know, kind of sweet, lemons, limes. But then, you know, I found that like even seltzer water tasted different, you know, presumably because of the salt content in seltzer water. But yeah, I would highly recommend that. Are you saying miracle berry? Yeah, miracle berry. Okay, so then how do you you know, mitigate the changes in olfaction as we age? You know, that's an interesting topic. I've never really thought about that. I've never really heard anybody talk about that. Well, so we know, so the olfactory system is extremely unique. And again, I keep saying olfactory system. Olfactory system refers to our sense of smell, right? And our olfactory system is one of the most dynamic parts of the nervous system. It's where one of the few places in the adult brain where neurogenesis occurs within the olfactory system. And also the turnover of the types of receptors that are present, the literal like chemoreceptors, the receptors that, you know, when you eat, let's say chocolate, whatever it is that causes chocolate to taste like chocolate, those molecules literally bind receptors, and that's how you detect the presence of chocolate. Those receptors are sort of surprisingly rapidly replaced with new receptors. And one of the things that happens, one of the benefits, miracle berry creates a temporary change. Yeah, it's definitely not permanent. Don't worry about that. It actually doesn't last all that long. But I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. But so olfactory receptors are changing very regularly, and that's part of the reason for why, you know, if you ever drive through an agricultural area or an area with a lot of, you know, a certain kind of factory, or, you know, whatever, when you first are driving through, you're like, oh my God, like it smells like cow manure, like, or it smells like, you know, whatever. I remember there was this part of Colorado that always smelled like Pringles. I don't know. I think they were making dog food at that, and I think it was like a Yukonuba place or something like that, or Iams. Anyways, driving by, it was always like, it's like somebody just popped a Pringles can. But whatever, you go to a different, country that have sort of a different distribution of spices and stuff like that. Paper factory is a great example. When you first get there, you're like, whoa, this is so different. This like sort of punches you in the nose, right? But then after a little while, you become accustomed to it, right? And that's true if you live in an area that's very, has a lot of agricultural activity or whatever, that has a sort of a consistent presence of an olfactory experience, of a smell. You become accustomed to it, right? And eventually you get to the point where you don't even really smell it anymore. And that's because your olfactory system has adapted, right? And so if a bunch of olfactory receptors are just constantly being saturated with a given molecule, the olfactory system will adapt and then reduce the availability of those receptors so that, you don't even register the presence of those molecules. And so all of this to say, I could imagine that there might be an effect of, as we age, if you are, as we get older, right, I think it's pretty safe to assume that we tend to kind of begin to, let's say, ossify a bit, right? Our daily routines become a little bit more consistent. We're not exploring quite as many novel experiences. And so I could imagine that the olfactory landscape, right, the distribution of flavors that you consume becomes pretty static. And so I could imagine there being a benefit to just ensuring that you don't allow yourself to just stagnate olfactorily, right? Where, you explore new types of flavors. And perhaps, strong flavors. Like if you've never experienced anything with truffle in it, I highly recommend it. I mean, I know some people hate that flavor, and it's not exactly cheap, of course, but it is such a strong and unique flavor. Stinky cheeses, that's what I would go with too, maybe combining them. But like just like I suspect that, just like we know that there's a benefit to exposing yourself to a bunch of novel cognitive challenges, I suspect there might be a benefit in terms of the olfactory system of, if you eat the same thing on every Monday, every Tuesday, every Wednesday, if you sort of mix it up and introduce some new stuff, there might be a sort of a beneficial effect, but pure speculation. But that Rebel Dog Duke, that was just pure speculation, but super interesting. That's something I'm going to be thinking about now for a while. Let's talk about benzodiazepines. Sure, Betty. Benzodiazepines are a very useful category of medications. They used to be used quite a bit more. Particularly, I believe in the 60s, the 50s and the 60s, or the 60s, particularly for housewives who were, because of rapid changes in American society or society in the United States, had a completely different kind of experience, and not everybody loved it, and so their psychiatrists would prescribe Xanax or Valium. Eventually it was learned that maybe that's not the best idea because it's very easy to rapidly generate a substance dependence on benzodiazepines. And that's true for essentially every psychoactive substance, but the problem with substance dependence on benzodiazepines is that withdrawal from benzos can be life-threatening. It can potentially induce seizures. And so that is the reason for why physicians, particularly in the last couple of years, have really made an effort to reduce their prescription or the prescribing of benzodiazepines. Benzos used to be regularly prescribed for anxiety-associated conditions, but definitely not, and they're still prescribed for panic disorders or anxiety attacks, but they're just not really considered to be an optimal chronic medication. So yeah, what else? What it's interesting. Benzodiazepines came after a sort of a previously more prominent category of drugs called barbiturates. Barbiturates they bind the same receptor, the GABA receptor, but they have a completely different mechanism. Benzodiazepines don't bind where the GABA neurotransmitter binds. They bind at a site called the benzodiazepine receptor site. A specific area of the GABA receptor. Again, GABA is the nervous system's off signal, reduces activity, reduces firing, and benzodiazepine, Orange County dude. I'm jealous. I bet your weather is a lot nicer than it is over here in Philly. So benzodiazepines like Xanax, alprazolam, or Klonopin, clonazepam, or diazepam, or in other words, Valium. So yeah, and so what benzodiazepines do, which is what makes them actually a far safer medication than barbiturates, is that it just renders the GABA receptor more sensitive, more ready to react when GABA itself binds, which is a really interesting, unique, it's called a positive allosteric modulator, if you're interested, PAM. But in any case, yeah, so that's a sort of short story. We also know that that benzodiazepines are being used, illicitly, whatever, being used recreationally more widely these days. So it's not just opioids that are escalating in their recreational use, it's benzodiazepines. And also, I think worth acknowledging is that there's a whole category of what you might call gray market drugs that are not benzodiazepines, but they're very, very similar. So, we're talking about like etizolam is one of them. I'm forgetting. There's like 3 that have been widely used. But in any case, yeah. So that is a sort of a kind of an emerging, that's going to be an emerging concern, I think, in the United States, in addition to opioids, particularly because if you mix opioids and benzodiazepines, that is like one of the most dangerous pharmacological interactions. Because at a dose that's not as high as somebody would normally take of each drug individually, like let's say somebody's used to taking 10 milligrams of Xanax, right, which is a lot, and then they're used to taking 40 milligrams of oxycodone, right? So we're talking about somebody who has a tolerance to both of these substances. They might assume that they would be just fine if they took only 8 milligrams of Xanax and only 20 milligrams of oxycodone, but that could potentially increase the likelihood of respiratory failure. So it's a really dangerous combination. And I think that as I always rant on and on about the opioid overdose fatality epidemic in the United States, more people have died from that in the past 12 months than ever in the nation's history, which I would hope that we'd be talking about a lot more if there wasn't another more prominent, more disastrous public health emergency. But in any case, I suspect that we're going to start seeing even greater escalations just because of more widespread use of benzos. So where am I going to go after Periscope closes down? So I have already explored 2 different platforms. Right now, for example, I'm live on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. There's a link in my profile page on Periscope. And then also there's a new streaming platform that I really like a lot. And Crooked Muse L is also a member there, called haps.tv. Haps.tv. It's probably a more direct recipient of the applications of Periscope and pretty much every streaming platform, but they have way more tools available. Great philosophy, really great community. So you can check out that platform by going to my profile page here on Periscope and then just clicking one or both of those links. Okay. So somebody, should I invest in companies working on medical psychedelics? Well, Roy Rogers, you would not be the only person to do that if you did. Just I think 2 weeks ago, perhaps. Well, first of all, there's a company called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. They're technically a pharmaceutical company, but they are essentially singularly responsible for what is likely to be the approval of the use of MDMA, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, otherwise known as ecstasy or Molly. It used to be called a bunch of different things in the past, but I think it's most commonly called Molly these days, which was used. Its recreational use was first established in Texas, of all places, believe it or not. I believe in Dallas, and in the Dallas area, and then it very rapidly expanded. This was when their rave culture was far more prominent, underground raves and stuff like that. Really interesting story to the sort of the early pushers, I guess literally pushers of MDMA, a guy named Stryker, I'm happy to. I would love to explore that story if you would indulge me, but I won't go there if you don't want to. Anyway, so MAPS, but they're also conducting studies, clinical trials, like submitting data to the FDA and everything with psilocybin. We know that the medical school at New York University, NYU, the Langone Medical School, has been performing studies of psilocybin for the use for psychiatric applications, showing some positive results. Also cannabis, by the way. They're a rather progressive medical school. Let's see, there are other schools. Johns Hopkins, in one of the best medical schools in the world, has conducted some of those studies. Let's see, where else? There's one more that I'm forgetting. I believe one of the UCs, one of the University of California's, has conducted some as well. But in addition to that, a company called Compass RPM or something like that. Compass Pathways is a VC company that is basically funded by Peter Thiel of maybe it was UC Davis. It might be multiple of them. I'm remembering back to the Society for Neuroscience conference. Compass Pathways, funded by Peter Thiel of PayPal, of Palantir fame and billionaire status. He just invested in a lab, literally here in Philadelphia at the University of the Sciences, who is not only, and so listen, like if I had a big pot of money, well, I would do a lot of things, but I would certainly invest in a company like so the issue with MAPS is that they're not really, they're very unique. They're a pharmaceutical company, sort of technically, but they don't function like a Pfizer or your Eli Lilly or whatever, right? They're not. Their principal goal is not to generate profit. So that's a pretty big distinction relative to the vast majority of the pharmaceutical industry. So I don't know that you can even invest. It's more like an altruistic endeavor. But there are companies that will definitely capitalize on this. But if I had a big pot of money, this is what I would do. I would do what Compass Pathways did. So they invested in this lab. Not a ton of money, $500,000. I mean, it's a lot of money to me, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to research, that's not a lot of money. Again, that would fundamentally transform my life. but when it comes to like basic science research, usually like a grant in the lab in which I did my PhD, several $1 million over the course of several years. So it may very well be the case that Compass Pathways does generate, does give another $500K or something like that to this lab. But anyways, it's this lab at the University of the Sciences here in Philadelphia, as I said, and their goal, this is the kind of company I would look for. I would look for a company that is interested in studying the potential psychiatric applications of psychedelics. However, I would focus on companies that are interested in generating analogs of those substances. So not specifically using psilocybin, not specifically using MDMA or whatever substance you want to focus on, but rather developing molecules that are sort of based on those original, let's say, mother molecules. For two reasons. First of all, I think that there have been demonstrated psychiatric benefits from some of these molecules, right? And I am confident that we will continue to see more and more potential psychiatric applications of these substances. However, I suspect, it is just, undeniably true that there are a lot of off-target effects of these substances, right? Having hallucinations isn't necessarily like the therapeutic agent of psilocybin, right? It's probably not. It's probably just a consequence of, a consequence of, the pharmacology, the simple molecule of psilocybin. So if you could generate a molecule that delivers the same therapeutic benefits, but doesn't induce, 6, 7, 8 hours of hallucinations, might be, I think that would be a superior strategy. And I think it's going to be, what's going on? I'm sorry, YouTube. There's something wonky going on with my internet. But anyways, so that's what I would focus on. That's reason number one. I think that there's a scientific justification for doing that. Reason number two, however, is that it's going to be a lot easier to patent those analogs than those substances. Okay? Because you've invented those substances. They're completely novel. And so it'll be very easy to get those patents, or much easier, I should say. And so as a result, much more profit will be generated, right? That's how profit is generated in the pharmaceutical space. Well, not exclusively, but broadly speaking, that's how, profit is generated in the pharmaceutical space. So That's what I would look for. And I don't have any names for you, unfortunately, but that's what I would look for. What company said may bring MDMA to the market? So that's MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. I've heard of Champignon. HAPS is visually confusing, not clean. No governments are in HAPS. Periscope will someone buy Perry? No. Periscope is just folding. I mean, it's just Twitter. They're just folding it into Twitter completely. After many missed opportunities from this company, it's sort of tragic. Okay, what do you know about EMDR therapy for trauma? How does it work? EMDR is very interesting. So for anybody that's unfamiliar with EMDR is basically a sensory treatment. So it's basically the exposure to certain patterns of light stimulation of the eyes. And it has been shown to be, beneficial for some folks, specifically suffering from PTSD. Its mechanism, I don't think has been established at all. I think that there's some speculation where it's sort of similar to the speculation of how something like binaural beats work, right? Where you're basically synchronizing activity. Jeez, I'm so sorry. This is ridiculous. You're sort of synchronizing activity across different brain regions by influencing your sensory systems. And so by having a specific pattern of light exposure to the brain, or I'm sorry, to the eyes, a lot of the brain is devoted to vision, right? A tremendous proportion of the brain's real estate is devoted to vision. And so one could imagine that there is just a sort of downstream consequence of having a specific pattern of brain activity occurring due to that light. Oh no, yeah, that's what I figured. And so it may somehow. So here's what I would speculate. And I don't know if you can see this right now, but here's what I would speculate: that there is a benefit to, or that when somebody's undergoing treatment for a psychiatric condition, if somebody is constantly aroused, meaning anxious, in fight or flight, the ability of a therapist to effectively treat that person can be reduced, right? Because it's just much more difficult to engage somebody who's just white knuckling, right? And so it may be the case, pure speculation right now, it may be the case that by sort of entraining different populations of neurons, you can predispose the brain to entering into what's called, A wave activity, or just sort of different patterns of oscillatory waves that propagate through the brain when somebody's calm, and sort of pensive, not necessarily, not asleep, but when you're sort of calm and not aroused, not focused on any specific thing in your environment, certainly not in fight or flight, which then renders therapy more effective. That's what I suspect would be the mechanism, but I have not seen a paper that demonstrates that at all. But if I'm right, I'm going to brag about it a lot. First sight as patients. Patents was the main reason. Yeah, exactly, Frank. Yeah. Not sure how to ask this eloquently. Have there been studies on mental health and placebo diagnosis? For example, a person will act out their diagnosis. Yes, that totally makes sense, Melinda. Absolutely. Not that mental health is a choice, but does cause and effect sometimes play out. I think that's a wonderful thing to consider. I mean, so basically what you're saying is at what point does a psychiatric diagnosis become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where somebody tells you you have depression, and you therefore could you therefore be predisposed to experiencing depression? Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think that's a nutty thing to wonder. I mean, it is undeniably the case that the environment influences brain activity, influences your cognitive experience, your emotional experiences. And, there's a well-known documented bias that we all have, where we all assign a level of respect to somebody wearing a white lab coat, whether they're an actual doctor or not. But people come across as more authoritative when they're wearing a white lab coat, but also probably the case when somebody has an MD or a PhD. And so as a result, if you have somebody who has all of those, titles, or they're dressed like a physician, and they're telling you something about you, right? I don't think it's nuts to wonder whether or not they can have a sort of top-down effect. However, I think it's safe to say there's enough evidence now that demonstrates that conditions like depression are biological in nature, right? Where, you can measure differences in patterns of brain activity, even in neuroanatomy, in somebody who has been suffering from depression relative to somebody who has not. There's even, there have been studies that have demonstrated some genetic predispositions that people can have to suffering from depression. The most famous probably is this giant study that was done in New Zealand that basically showed if you inherited a certain form of a gene that's associated with serotonin transmission, if you inherit a certain form of that gene and you live a totally normal life, you're not more likely to develop depression than somebody who has the sort of, let's say, the normal version, the non-depression version of that serotonin gene. However, if you do have that version of the gene and you experience some form of trauma, you're much more likely to develop depression. And so you're going to, there's a lot of examples of things like that, right? Where you have a sort of a predisposition and then some environmental event, some experience triggers the development of a condition. And so while I totally think it is absolutely reasonable to speculate about, the effects of a diagnosis on cognition, the placebo effect is super well documented. It wouldn't technically be the placebo effect. But patients who believe that they're getting a treatment that's effective are more likely, if they're optimistic about their treatment, they're more likely to recover from their condition. And so, while I don't think it is unreasonable to speculate about that, I do think that by and large, by the vast majority of the time, cases of depression are the byproduct of biological phenomena that occur that are the byproducts of both a combination of genes, the genes you inherit, your epigenome that you, at least in part, inherited from your parents, as well as the environment, right? It's both nature and nurture. And also, Melinda, I think it's also fair to wonder, and I've talked to tons of people who have expressed this, where once they're suffering for some reason, they don't know why, but they usually have some kind of some notion of why. But when they find out, when a physician tells them like, "Oh, you have depression," it's empowering. It's like, oh, finally, I know. Finally, I get it. And then, of course, access to the solutions, meager as they are today, but access to the solutions that are available for the treatment of depression, is also obviously very important. So I think it would cut both ways, right? It wouldn't just be a top-down effect. But I like the way you're thinking. Okay. What do you think about LSD? I think it's a very interesting molecule. Never thought I would get a stock recommendation in here. This is not financial advice. And frankly, I don't know if there are any pharmaceutical companies that are at least publicly, gosh, this just looks like garbage, that are at least publicly doing the kind of work that I was talking about. Unbelievable. Sorry, everybody. I know this just looks like garbage, but my camera is just confused. Makes sense. Yeah. I believe that's what the Canadian company I've been doing is looking at. Oh, interesting. Roy, I'd be really interested. Oh, Champignon. That's the name of the company? Interesting. Champignon. I am not familiar with that. Cool. I'll check that out. Enlighten us to the Canadian name. Yeah. The symbol is shrimp. I bet SHRM, shroom, is probably not a mistake. I was diagnosed with OCD, ADHD, and schizoaffective disorder till I was in my late teens. Then I went to an institute that took one of the tests and came back autism spectrum disorder, and then everything made better sense. Yeah, it is often the case that psychiatric conditions don't come alone, right? And it sort of makes sense, right? Because it's not like there is an OCD part of the brain or a depression part of the brain, right? A lot of these conditions share a lot of symptoms. Anxiety is very consistent to all of them, by the way. One of the reasons I find it an interesting thing to study. But, it's because a lot of the brain regions that are involved in these will overlap. And then the things that distinguish these conditions are the brain regions that do not overlap. OCD, the dorsal striatum would be, probably far more significant than to, certainly ADHD. There's an interesting role of the striatum in general in ADHD, but schizoaffective disorder probably less relevant, the dorsal striatum, and so yeah, so in other words, like I it's not necessarily like it shouldn't be like shocking that somebody would be diagnosed with multiple psychiatric conditions. But as you note, autism spectrum disorder, that's a much broader, difference in somebody's brain that will manifest in a variety of ways that don't necessarily seem connected, right? Routine behaviors, perseveration, anxiety, of course, obviously unique social interaction, and not all of these you would necessarily connect intuitively to each other. But I'm glad to hear that you got you got some competent clinical engagement. Would you wear a lab coat on your next broadcast? I want to test that theory. Yeah, I will. I actually just unpacked my. We've been moving into this apartment for like 6 months. I just unpacked my my lab coat. It has my name on it and everything. I used to do that actually on in the early days of Periscope when I was still working in the lab. And there is this one person, gosh, I can't remember her name, but she was always like, "Where's your lab coat? Where's your lab coat?" And so one day I did it, and it's true. I think it did have an effect on how many people were in there. Yeah. All right. Well, perhaps I will call it. The effects of positive affirmations can be pretty powerful, which is confusing to me on that subject. Totally. I mean, there's interesting studies that have measured like the effects of certain, and it is barely not pop science, just to be fair, but the effects of like, repeating positive, positive, ambitious goals or power words or these types of things where, levels of testosterone can be measured to change in both men and women, which is interesting. Testosterone is one of those, I think, highly overrated hormones. It's very, very important, don't get me wrong, but I think people pay way too much attention to testosterone. One thing that I just read in a study that I was unaware of is that something like only 56%, so just a little bit more than half of what determines a person's testosterone levels is determined by the presence of the Y chromosome. 56%? That's like nothing. I mean, it's obviously it's the majority, but it's just the majority, just barely the majority. A bunch of other factors influence someone's testosterone levels. Pretty crazy, right? And I should say, the presence of the Y chromosome, like the genes that one is inherited from, well, specifically their father. So yeah, I find it fascinating that certain brain abnormalities go along with certain facial features. So that is true in some cases, right? But there are some old school studies, many of which have been debunked since they were published, where there was like the criminal face. Gosh, who was it? Can't remember the scientist's name. Ah, man, that's so frustrating. But he published a paper. Where he basically took pictures of all of these violent criminals, specifically violent criminals, and came up with the average face. And what was really funny about this study is, gosh, I can't believe I forgot. What was funny about this study is that the face that was generated when he averaged all of these faces was a really handsome dude. It was like a face that everybody thought was like super attractive. And that gave rise to the theory of, the more sort of average a person's face is, average in terms of like all the various sort of like, tail ends of like facial morphology, right? The more beautiful we perceive them to be. And there's a company called like Max Effect, not Max Effect. Max, it's like a makeup company. It's a very famous old makeup company where this dude would purport to measure your facial features and then devise with like a mechanism that he invented. His name was Max. His first name was Max, and then he had, I think, like a Russian or Polish last name. And Max Factor. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. Yeah, I highly recommend checking out the sort of history of Max Factor because it is just, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's cool, but it was also in that era where there was a lot of like pseudoscience and literal snake oil being sold. Yeah. But in any case, I bring all this up because, like, you're right. Of course, there are certain conditions that have kind of like, facial morphologies that are associated. Down syndrome can be is one example. But by and large, it's a dangerous thing to do, to assume that outward features reveal something about a person's inner biology. Because, and here's why, as humans, right, we evolved to pay a lot of attention to what each other look like, right? That's why I like to use video live streaming. So you can see my eyes, you can, see my facial expressions, right? If I was just sitting here like this, or like, and I was talking about science, you'd probably have a slightly different effect or different experience of my my communication, right? And so we evolved, and hey, it's very difficult as a primate evolving in the savannas of Africa to be able to see someone's genes, right? And so we evolved to pay a lot of attention to facial features, facial expressions, and stuff like that. However, the problem is that those components of our genome, those components of our body, are only determined by a tiny, tiny collection of genes, right? And by, generally speaking, they're just not a good indicator, index of a person's genetic history, or their inner genetics. So you just want to be careful with that, right? But listen, I agree. It is an interesting. I always find that very interesting. The sort of how many different flavors human faces can come in. It's kind of a gross metaphor to use, a little Hannibal Lecter-esque, but we used to accompany you on your walks home during those times. What? Oh my gosh, you were there. Yeah, that was fun. Man, sometimes I would walk home from doing some microscopy, work at the microscope at like 5 a.m. after having gotten to the lab at like 10 the previous day. Okay, you seen the new AI commercial tool, Deep Nostalgia, animate old photos into videos. Yes, interesting technology and many interesting uses to come, I'm sure. Totally. But frankly, for me, like, here's what, so basically what Frank is bringing up on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, there's this company where you can upload arguably any photo, but they're advertising it to be, you can upload a photo of your deceased relatives, and they'll use, essentially deepfake technology to animate their face in subtle ways to make them look like they're, it's like it's a video of them just sitting there in front of the camera, right? For me, like, I would never use it to do that. I would never want to animate my deceased relatives. It just seems weird. I know it wouldn't be comforting to me, but what I would do is use that, put up a big picture frame in like the bathroom or something, or in like my living room or something, and I would make it super subtle, and I would animate somebody's face, right? I would make it super subtle so that when somebody's using the restroom, or somebody's like walking into my house and they like look up and they're like, did that painting just move? I think that would be a lot of fun. That's the only reason I would use it though. A lot of fun, that whole story. Okay, why can't we use 100% of our brain? Well, LT, we do. There is no law of nature that that limits the, you are not limited to 10% of your brain, which is, I'm sure, the number you might have been exposed to. You're not limited to any specific percentage at all. The only limit to how much of your brain is active at any one time is a limit beyond which you would be having a seizure, right? So the entire brain is at the entire brain's disposal. What determines whether or not a certain brain region is going to be activated is your experience, your environment, whether you've developed expertise, that depends upon activation of those brain regions. And by the way, in terms of your performance in any given, let's say you're playing a guitar, or you're cooking, or whatever it is, playing a sport of some sort, the greatest expertise will be associated with probably the least brain activity, right? Where, if you have a bunch of brain activity, that's going to be confusing. It's going to be a bunch of off target. You just want to minimize the patterns of brain activity just to the parts of the brain that are necessary to accomplish the task. So you want to minimize brain activity. Don't want to maximize it. And then, the other thing is that there's not like an empty lot in the brain. There's not like a hard drive slot that just hasn't been filled in the brain. Everything is being used. So the question isn't, can you use more of it? The question is, can you use it better, right? Can you optimize what brain regions are active when you're accomplishing any task? And of course, How does that arise? Practice, right? Developing expertise. They have that in Orlando in Harry Potter world where the paintings are talking and moving. Yeah, I would love that. And just imagine how funny it would be, like, if you had it in the bathroom. And again, it was super subtle, but like you had it in the bathroom and like the eyes, you know, classic like haunted house thing. The eyes like do this, you know, or like just subtly moves. Or it'd be equally funny if it was like just super fast ones, just like when somebody be like, "What? Did that thing just move?" And then it's still for like 10 minutes. And then I think that would be a lot of fun. I am going to do that. How does one know if they are actually crazy or not? Can one assess themselves? Oh my goodness gracious. That's, yeah, the handle. I love it. Is that hummus in your profile picture? Oh, no. So of course it can be very difficult, right? Part of the torment of having a psychiatric illness like schizophrenia, particularly schizophrenia, but also like bipolar disorder, is that a component of these psychoses that can occur, the auditory hallucinations more commonly than visual hallucinations, but both can occur in schizophrenia, is that part of it is that you believe it, is that you are driven by it. Another part of it is like particularly paranoid schizophrenia, where people will begin connecting dots in their environment that ought to not be connected. Where, for example, an example here in Philadelphia is that like during the winter when it's snowing, a lot of people are wearing wool coats, right? And the most common color, I bet statistically, is black, maybe also gray. People are getting a little bit more adventurous, I think, these days than they used to be, but like a lot of people wearing black and charcoal wool coats. Well, it looks almost, if one was so predisposed, if you were looking and you saw person after person walking by wearing essentially the same color coat or the same coat, if that threat detector is sort of at a hair trigger, you begin thinking, wait a second, why are they all wearing the same uniform? Is it a uniform? Are they following me? Why are they all around me, right? And so you can sort of spin off into these paranoid this paranoia. And that paranoia, even if like you've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, even if you know that you're probably wrong, you're still experiencing that severe fear and perception of threat. Okay, but the other interesting component of those mental illnesses is that, I don't think any of those, but I think people, I think differently than most people, so I feel like I might be crazy. Well, you do think differently than other people. I mean, everybody will have, even if you have an identical twin, even if it's a monochorionic identical twin, same placenta and everything, you will have some slight differences in patterns of brain activity. So, I mean, you can rest assured that you're right about that your intuition is correct. The question is, are those differences causing you to suffer or causing you to be less capable of living a fulfilling life, a satisfying life, high quality of life, or are they potentially dangerous, right? Do they predispose you to reacting violently, aggressively? That's the question, right? I think it's safe to say that Albert Einstein had unique patterns of brain activity. He was also a genius, right? He thought differently than everybody else. But that doesn't make him crazy, right? And it's not like we use the term crazy in neuroscience or in psychiatry, right? but colloquially, I think we know what we're talking about here. But the other thing that I was going to bring up is that people can know that they have schizophrenia. They can know that they are experiencing psychosis or hallucinations. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of this, not the only, but one of the most, is John Nash, who invented, I think, a Nobel laureate. Yeah, definitely a Nobel laureate. Developed game theory. He was schizophrenic, severely schizophrenic, and it takes a long time. And schizophrenia is a devastating condition. There's a bit of this tendency, I think, in some among some folks to romanticize that, and it should not be romanticized. It is debilitating. But he has articulated that even after he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, continued taking his medication and everything, he still experienced the hallucinations. And so, yes, you can know that you are mentally ill, but still experience it. And so yeah, that is why we should all be grateful that we have access to physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists who have devoted their lives to helping people sustain a higher quality of life despite these mental illnesses. Yeah, I have housed a schizophrenic who has a very proud personality and won't accept it. It's very sad. Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to some folks who, one person in particular I'm remembering in Scandinavia would call in, and there are some pretty consistent hallucinations or delusions that occur in schizophrenia. Very frequently, they have to do with religious experiences, spiritual experiences. Depending upon their particular religious predisposition. It could be Jesus. It could be God, or however it'll manifest that way. And that's what this gentleman was experiencing, and he knew he was diagnosed with it, but he said, I don't want to stop experiencing this. My physicians tell me that I have schizophrenia and that these are hallucinations, but I think there's something to so it's such a difficult issue, and there's a bunch of really interesting philosophical, ethical quandaries, right? Like, who are we to mandate that somebody who experiences these things get treatment if they're not violent, they're not dangerous, right? And generally speaking, people who have schizophrenia, mental illnesses in general, but including schizophrenia, much more frequently are the recipients of violence, of aggression, being exploited than the perpetrators. I think that's a widely held misconception that people with schizophrenia are dangerous. They're not. They're just as dangerous as pretty much anybody else. So, yeah, I should probably call it a night, everybody. I have to get back to work to this. Speaking of mental illness, I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. And today was an unusual day where we just did the live chat, although I did speak briefly about a new procedure that may reduce the need for liver transplants for both children and adults, particularly for children, but also adults. youtube.com/anthropoid. And then I'm also on a new live streaming platform called haps.tv, haps with 2 P's. And you can find that by clicking on the link in my profile on Periscope, where Haps is a principally a live streaming platform. It's a great community. The founders have really good heads on their shoulders, great philosophy, a lot of tools available. It's still early days for this platform. So, if you join, you have the opportunity to, pretty much determine how this platform grows. So I would recommend you check it out. If you enjoy this kind of interaction, it's probably where I'm going to be doing most of this kind of stuff after Periscope shutters. So I have a link in my profile. You can check it out there. So youtube.com/anthropoid and haps.tv/anthropoid, I think. Otherwise, have a great rest of your Sunday and a great beginning of your week. Hopefully I'll see you at some point this week. If not, I will see you next Sunday, same time, same place. See you there. Have a great week, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out on YouTube. I really appreciate it. Sorry I couldn't, do something a little bit more substantive today. Next time, I assure you. If you haven't subscribed and you're interested in this kind of stuff, or you have any tips, or you want to correct me on something, please, subscribe, leave a comment, hit that like button, smash it, prod it, poke it, hit it. Anyways, yeah, so if you haven't subscribed and you're interested, maybe consider subscribing. Otherwise, and I'm always receptive to any kind of input you might have. Otherwise, I will see you next week. See y'all.